Hello, this is Eric. Today is May the 9th, 2023. And in this video, we'll be talking about the military dictatorship, now covering the Ernesto Geisel government. It is dramatically important that you have already watched our previous videos on the military regime in Brazil. Otherwise, you will not understand much of what I have to tell you now in this video, okay? Well, so the military regime started with Castelo Branco, right? The military were supported by society in general, not everyone, obviously, but much of society supported the military regime because of the fear imposed to society regarding the communist danger, right? Society, the bourgeoisie was afraid that the communists could take power in Brazil. So they supported the military in that sense, right? Again, it was not the entire Catholic Church, for example, that supported the military. And we're going to see in this video that even the Catholic Church itself was not really harmoniously living with the Geisel government, right? But after Castelo Branco, we had Arthur Costa and Silva and President Médici that were genuine representatives of the hardline sector of the military. Right, so with Médici, we had the climax of the authoritarianism by the military in Brazil. And at the same time, we had the so-called Brazilian miracle that we explained, that we covered in detail in our last video. So now the thing is that in 1973, we had a petroleum crisis going on in the world, right? And all that Brazilian miracle that everybody talked about suddenly vanished away, just like vapor, right? And we had then Ernesto Geisel being referred as president. And he was in the middle of this conflict, because as I told you, the military itself, the military themselves were not, they did not all think the same way. There were those that supported the idea that the military were provisionally in power to then return the power to the civilians, and there were those hardliners, the hardliners that were not really that were not in favor of returning power to the civilians, to another or to other civilian presidents, right? So among all this chaotic scenario, this chaotic economic scenario, and this internal conflict, we have Ernesto Geisel. He was not really, and here you have a picture of him, he was not really a hardliner, right? But he did not believe really democracy. But although he did not believe in democracy, he confirmed and he believed that the military would not stay in power for too long, because the pressure from society, the pressure from the Catholic Church and many other sectors in society against the military was really huge. So he promised in the beginning of his mandate that he would gradually and slowly return, or at least place the country in the pathway towards democracy again. But that would be something that would take place gradually, right? And really, we can say that he fulfilled his promise, But it took him a long time to fulfill this promise, just like he told he was going to do. Okay, well, so you have now a picture of the scenario in Brazil, right? We have the Brazilian miracle. It simply vanished away, right? Now we have I would say, a worldwide crisis going on, right? And Brazil is really in a very difficult situation. And here, before we go on here, we must understand that first, Brazil was really dependent on oil. And that was one of the factors that led Brazil to this crisis in 19 or after 1973, because there were, the world watched the first oil crisis in 1973, and Brazil was so dependent on oil. On foreign oil, right? And that problem really causes a headache. We had like 80% of our oil imported. Let me say it again. We had almost 80% of our oil imported. And so the price of the barrel of oil increased 300%. So it was mandatory that Brazil found an alternative for oil. And that's something that is really going to be worked on. Also, because of this crisis, we had inflation going up again. And Brazil had to take more loans, more international loans, and that increased even more our external debt, right? So this is the scenario, right? Brazil started working on other ways to produce energy. And as a consequence, some of the measures that were taken in this period were the construction of hydroelectric plants, Itaipu and Marimbondo, especially these two, right? And Brazil started looking forward to having an opportunity of developing its own nuclear energy. I won't get into detail here because that would demand, a entire new class. But in the future, I intend, to record another video just to talk about this nuclear cooperation agreement between Brazil and Germany, right? But Brazil was really dependent on the U.S. However, for a couple of reasons, Brazil entered into this nuclear cooperation agreement with Germany, and Germany considered it as the deal of the century. It was very good for them. And so we're going to have, for example, in Angra dos Reis, the construction of a nuclear structure, right, to develop this new form of energy. And although Figueiredo, this whole thing about the nuclear energy didn't really flow, and Figueiredo, the next president, the following president after Geisel, had to, to put an end to this agreement with Germany during his government, that at least allowed Brazil to work on the nuclear energy and nuclear energy, a nuclear energy that could be produced by Brazil itself, right? But above all, although the nuclear energy did help Brazil somehow, we had the pro-ethanol. Right, Brazil started to find an alternative in terms of energy in ethanol, and I prepared here a video for you, talking about this. A video from the time, right? Let me place it here for you.
Combustível derivado de petróleo, produto cada vez mais escasso. O Brasil já encontrou solução para substituir o petróleo como combustível. Esta solução está no pró-álcool. Em 1978, produzimos 1 bilhão e 900 milhões de litros de álcool e adicionamos 1 bilhão e meio à gasolina. Em 1980, produziremos 3 bilhões e 900 milhões de litros que atenderão aos 20% de mistura na gasolina consumida no país e darão ainda para abastecer todos os carros movidos exclusivamente a álcool que a indústria nacional produzirá naquele ano. Os carros do serviço público estão sendo adaptados para consumirem exclusivamente álcool. O pró-álcool continuará crescendo, mas o petróleo importado ainda nos custa muito caro e levará tempo para ser substituído. Por isso, temos que economizá-lo. Faça a sua parte. Gaste menos 10%.
Well, that video just confirms what I had told you a few minutes before that. And as I told you, I mean, in the political scenario, we had the fight, I would say, between the government versus the hardliners, right? And that was really difficult for Geisel to handle because Ernesto Geisel itself was not a hardliner, but he had to live, with the hardliners. So what he had to do, what Geisel had to do, was sometimes make concessions and sometimes establish his own view, his own point. That was the political opening that would take place slowly, gradually, and in a secure manner, right? Well, we can see that clearly, right? For example, in this photo here, we have here his name. That was known as the Herzog case. He was a journalist, a very famous journalist at the time. This guy really fought against the military, right? And he was called, to give some clarification, I would say, to the military due to all the criticism that he published every day. And he ended up being found this way, dead. And for a long time, the military claimed that he committed suicide. But that's not the case, as many years later, we could learn about, because we found enough documentation to say that that was not the case, that he was really murdered by the regime. We also had Manuel Filho, right, that died in conditions identical to those of Herzog, the journalist, right? And in that case, that's what I'm trying to tell you now. In the Herzog case, the journalist, in the journalist case, in the Herzog case, the military, the Ernesto Geisel government really didn't give too much information and did its best, to try to conceal that. But in this other case with Manuel Filho, that was found dead in conditions identical to those of Herzog, Geisel removed from the command of the Second Army General Ednardo Dávila Melo. So that shows us how Geisel had to juggle, all the circumstances. He had to deal with each circumstance in a different manner, so that he did not lose control. In terms of keeping the regime operating in the country, but at the same time preventing the hardliners from, assuming power in the country. And there were even situations in which Geisel, had to fight against certain hardliners that tried to apply coups to take Geisel out of power. And he managed to block all these attempts and stay in power. We also had, since the country was not going through, a very, I would say, a very easy moment in economic terms, that allowed the opposition to achieve some victories in the political sphere, right? We had the legislative elections in 1974, right? And in this election, we had the MPB, that was the other political party. We had Arena, the government party, and we had MDP. That was, I would say, the opposition power, but operating the opposition the opposition party that operated basically consenting with what the government established, right? But in this year, the MDB managed to establish many and many politicians in the legislative power. So that caused, the Geisel government to work in that sense, so that this opposition did not grow too much. So we had the Falcão Law, right? That was Law 6,339-76. It was created on July 1st, right? It was named after its creator, then Minister of Justice, Armando Falcão. And this law was created during the Geisel government, as I said, from 1974 to 1979, and it aimed to implement changes in relation to electoral and advertisements broadcast by television and radio in the Brazilian, let me go back here to my slide, in the Brazilian territory. So basically, this law is going to propose a new wording to Article 250 of the Electoral Code. And in practical terms, this law banned, all politicians from announcing in their advertisements all their information and brief data on their life trajectory. They could not broadcast songs with lyrics, right? Nor speeches or images. So the only exception was in relation to the candidate's photo, which could be displayed on television, along with the candidate's respective name, party, and the reading of the candidate's summary or resume in some cases, right? And also they could not advertise the time and place of the rallies. So, obviously the military had to justify the kind of thing. So they said that the law basically aimed to give equality to the candidates and political parties upon their presentations to Brazilians, because not all parties, could afford, to advertise on television and radio, right? So the Falcon Act or the Falcon Law restricted, these privileges that some would have over the others. The problem is that we only had two political parties. So really, this excuse was really bad. That was a really dreadful excuse. But anyway, we had then, the MDB working on alternative advertisement, and this opposition was growing day by day. So since it kept growing, we're going to have in the following year, in 1977, we're going to have the April package. That was a set of laws granted on April 13th, right, by Geisel himself. And among other measures, it temporarily closed the National Congress, right? It was the press that called the set of laws the April package, right? And basically, we had some changes in the Constitution that were made by the Constituent Assembly, right? And it was clear that the changes actually would not have been made by a Constituent Assembly. That was the official information given. But actually, it turned out that not only did the Congress, not only was the Congress closed, but this April package established the so-called bionic senators. That was the indirect the indirect election of 1/3 of the senators. Yeah, so if they couldn't overcome the opposition, they could establish their own will, and that's it, period. Right? And the other thing that the April package set forth was the increase of the presidential term to 6 years. And so Figueiredo, the next president, would be benefited by that and would stay in power for 6 years. Right? Well, but at the end of the whole thing, Geisel ended up fulfilling what he had promised, right? So he revoked Constitutional Amendment number 11. That basically was the amendment that gave room for the Institutional Act number 5, which represented the most rigid moment of the regime, of the dictatorship. So because of that, the end of impeachments and recesses of the Congress was established as of 1978, right? We had a reduction in censorship in the country. We had the return of habeas corpus. Remember that it had been declined, that it had been basically eliminated after Artur Costa Silva, right? And even so, the country was really going through a delicate moment. We still had, the wages squeeze going on. Inflation was really on the skies. And so we had workers with their economic power really, really impaired, right, hampered. And so what we are going to see by the end of the Geisel mandate, by the end of the Geisel government, is lots of strikes in the ABC region. That's the area where I personally lived for many years in my life. That was an area where we had many industries there with all their structures established, right? And so because of all this difficult situation, the salaries, the wages that were really squeezed, and at the same time inflation going on, because of all that, we're going to see many strikes, many worker strikes in the ABC region and in Brazil. And here in this photo, you have this guy here on your right, that is current President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He was a worker at the time, and he was one of the main leaders of these strikes going on in Brazil, and especially in the ABC area. And he is then years later going to be elected actually for 2 terms as president, and now for a 3rd term again since the beginning of this year of 2023, right? Well, so this is what I had to tell you guys. I hope you have enjoyed it. And in our next video, we will be talking about Figueiredo, right, and the end of the military regime. Thank you so much, and see you then.